Okay, so in this video, we're actually going to pick up right where we left off in the previous. We're going to touch a little bit on the properties, but I think we pretty much exhausted that in the previous video. We're going to take a deeper dive into working with real SharePoint data and also working with the SharePoint workbench that's stored in the development tenant. As of to date, all the way up into this part, we've been dealing with only the local host, if you would, and only dealing with mock data and not real SharePoint data. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to do is double check everything is working as expected. So what all I'm going to do is right now is just do a gulp serve on my project. And this is just going to serve this up in the local host as we have done in the previous video. So I'm just coming here, and you may be dealing with the Hello World web part. Because I had to modify my web part and change it, I created this Deshaun's World web part. And all the web part seems to be working as expected. We still have our checkbox and drop down, but it seems as if the last one is undefined. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we want to go and set the default value for Deshaun 2, which is our, let's call this Deshaun drop down web part. Our property. So it's going to web part property, and that's been, let me do a control S here to save it, and this is going to be this test2. So if you remember, in order to set default values for web part properties, that is set in the, that's right, manifest.js file. So what we have to do is go in this guy, hit comma, test2, and just give it a value. This is going to be one of the options in the select. So let's take a closer look at that. So this is going to be the drop down property, web part property, and then you're going to have these key values 1, 2, and through 4. We explicitly did 1 only through a test. So let's turn that back, control S to save it. Now let's have this default to 3. So in the manifest, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just go ahead and specify 3. I don't know if it's specify 3. Okay, in double quotes. It didn't like single quotes for some odd reason. Okay, so now we go ahead and save this. Go back. This is automatically refreshing. Add in the new web part instance. Still undefined. Why is that? That's right. So we have to stop gulp serve and then reissue it, because the manifest change, as we see in the previous video, does not capture, it's not captured in a live reload. So we exit out of the gulp serve. Let me try the gulp serve again. Now in the browser, I should get a new tab. All right, so to avoid confusion, I'm gonna kill the old one. Hit the plus sign, add Deshaun's World, and voila, 3 is defaulted. Let's double check. In the drop down, it is defaulted. If I select 2, I get expected number here. If I select 4, I get the expected number here. Open up a new instance, still defaults to 3. So this is working as expected. Okay, so that was a quick review. We got that default set. We do not have any undefined, so I think we're looking great. So now what we want to do, we're picking up in the tutorial that Microsoft issued for the client-side web part, and now we're actually going to start interacting with SharePoint data. Now, one of the things that they have, and I have here in a separate screen, a bunch of code snippets that I would paste in only because I don't want to waste a lot of video and bore you to death with a bunch of typos. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in this new paragraph tag, and basically what this is going to do, this is going to bring in the current web title. So if you take a look at this, you have the context, which is very similar to SPClassroom. If you're still doing the full trust thing in WSP, and then you have the page context, and then the web, and then the title. Whereas SP web is .current, and then web, and then title. So this is very similar to that. So let me just drop this in and click save. So now I'm loaded, and it says local workbench, right? Again, this is not going to show me SharePoint data because this is not in the context of the O365 dev site collection or dev tenant. Okay, so this is a disconnected mode. Right now it doesn't know anything about SharePoint, And I suspect, only because I peeked ahead and I've seen some of the other tutorials or some of the other details in this tutorial, I suspect Microsoft has created a bunch of mock classes or interface that is mocking this data because they're detecting that you're in local mode versus an actual tenant. So now let's do this. Let's actually fire this up in a tenant. Now what I'm doing, I'm just going to this dev01, which is that site collection we created in the environment setup video, and this is the home page for that. So all we have to do is navigate to that document library, the default library that we created, the client-side app ID column, and then just click on the Workbench ASPX, which is the one that we uploaded. And once I do that, my web part magically appears. No idea how they're doing this. I don't know if this is in hack because we're in preview mode, or if this is going to be the real deal. I don't know, but I love it. It works out. So once I click on that, let's see what happens. I instantly get dev01, okay, which is the title of the current site collection, or in this case, the current web, the root web. So let me change this. So loading from, let me change this to web title, and just kind of show how this thing interacts when you're actually doing a dev cycle. So I'm saving that. In my workbench, I get the automatic reload because the live reload is going to refresh the page on save. But in my tenant, I do not get the live reload. So I have to do the painstaking task of hitting refresh on the browser. And as a developer, especially a web developer, we're definitely accustomed to refreshes on the browser. So here I have web title, and then that's going to give me the current title. And this is live data. Now, I don't believe it, right? So what I want to do, I'm going to see some more examples. So let me just copy and paste a new paragraph tag, use my trusty old TypeScript IntelliSense, and now as you can see, I have these 4 or 5 properties to choose from. The absolute URL, the ID, which I assume is the GUID, permission, I have no idea, server relative URL, which is just what it says, and then the title, and we've been working with the title. So let me go ahead and bring in the absolute URL. Now another thing about these properties, before we select that and show the example, you would, if you know anything about the SharePoint API, you know there's way more options than this. And basically what's happening behind the scenes, only because we're going to do something very similar, is that there are interfaces or classes that we're building locally that's only being hydrated with a subset of the actual JSON or the data that's being returned from SharePoint itself via restAPI or whatever the case may be. I'm pretty certain they're using restAPI in the current context. So here's absolute URL. So we're going to paste that in, and we want to see that explicitly, only because Deshaun is just want to make sure there's no shenanigans going on. So we come back over here. Now I'm gonna call out these pages, as much as I remember. This is the dev tenant, and then here you can see that is absolutely the URL to this site collection in my tenant. Okay. So another thing that we can do now, if we go back to, hopefully I don't get too mixed up with the tabs. If we go back to my local, my laptop version, right? My local workbench, this is just going to be a Contasso URL, right? Which is their famous sample company that Microsoft does a lot of its demos on across a lot of its different products. And we will notice that this has the quadruple W versus the triple dub in the URL. So again, this is clearly an example of mock data. So we're actually going to start building some of that. Now, I was very curious, and I wanted to do this. What I want to do, I want to hyperlink the title, the web title, right, with an anchor tag. So I know in some languages like JavaScript, Angular, there are certain tokens and different notations and all the other stuff you have to do, like nghref and things along those lines when you're starting building things dynamically as far as like URLs and such. So all I'm going to do is just wrap this title and then just take the same token. I'm going to copy this, put it in the href, I'm not using nghref because I don't have the Angular library or any of that stuff loaded in. And I suspect this will be fine because from a cycle standpoint, this has still been serving up from JavaScript. So we're still controlling and manipulating the DOM. Whereas in Angular, there's a special process that you have to do that says, hey, the DOM is loaded, but I want to add this in this dynamic content. And then that nghref works its magic and makes sure everything syncs up. So if I hit save here, and then a reload, okay, this guy seems to be linked, and it's going somewhere else, so it's going to send me to that fake cursor site. Now I'm gonna go to the dev tenant. Here I have to manually reload. That's hyperlinked, and if I click on it, I go directly to the site collection. So everything seems to be wired up and working as expected. Okay, so that's the page context. What else is on the page context? So if you hit dot, you have site, you have user, you have web. Let's take a look at user. I haven't practiced this, so if this blows up, it'll just be one of those demo, non-practice demo lessons. Okay, so, but you guys are cool, so we make mistakes together. So let's go ahead and the login name, right? So basically I'm saying, okay, give me the current user login name, hit save. All right, so this is my local, and then this is the fake one, right? And then if I go to the actual tenant, I'll have to navigate to my workbench. If I go to the actual tenant, there it is. That's my actual username for my dev tenant. Pretty awesome, pretty slick. Okay, so so you have that, and that's not a lot of work, right? And we didn't have to bring in any extra libraries, only because I think the library that was needed for the context is already brought in. It seems as if that's what this line. Let me see if I can scroll over here. I think this line here, IP web part context, I think this is what is giving us access to that guy, right? So I think as we load it in, you know, the web part from the Yeoman generator, we got exactly what was needed in order for that to work. So, you know, no API URLs, no current web URL or anything like that was needed. These are loaded for you by default. Another sweet thing compared to like add-ins and some of the other calls, remote calls into O365, I don't see, right, or they're hiding it or they handling that for us, all the OAuth and authentication tokens and request digest and all that nastiness for authentication to ensure that only the authorized users making these types of requests. So that is very neat, and I think that's something that we were kind of spoiled with in the WSP coding because all of that was just there for us and we just took full advantage of it. But then when you move to CSOM or restAPI, that's when you start to realize that, oh, a lot of the stuff that was done for me, I have to do it manually. So I need to smarten up and understand how OAuth and OAuth 2 and all that stuff works and how long my token life is and all this nastiness. So this is pretty sweet indeed. Okay, so now what we want to do, let's move forward in actually some REST API calls. Now what we're going to do, we're going to use the out-of-the-box REST API. So if you're familiar with those, that's going to be the ones that start with _API /web/ whatever you need to do. So an example given by Microsoft, what they help us through in the tutorial is to actually pull in all the lists for the current web. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Now I'm gonna just, again, dropping these code snippets, one to save on video time and get straight to the point and not deal with all the copy errors. Okay, so I've already been playing around with this, so I paste this in and it already existed, so I got the nice squiggly that says, hey, these guys are already defined. Now, what's happening is that we're defining these two interfaces. One is the actual interface, which is going to be the SP list. As we saw here in the web object, we only have a subset of what's available in the actual JSON. So here we say, okay, we're going to pull this list, but we're only going to store title, and we're only going to store the ID, even though we know ID is GUID. They're going to treat both of those as string type. Fine, nothing fancy there. And then the second one, I'm still not 100% why we do this, especially because in most of the pieces where we need a list array, like to hold the array of objects, we don't use this guy. So, but anyway, they're defining this interface for a list collection, which is just an array of this objects of this type or this interface, and they're just going to hold it in this array, and that's going to be the sort in the value property. Okay, so that snippet's there. Now, here's where things get interesting. Now, we talked about that, when we're looking at login name, there was some magic, right? Shenanigans going on in the background that when we display this in the local environment, it showed user at cotoso.com. But when we showed it in the dev tenant, it showed the actual tenant name. So they actually create, there's a mock, well, what we're going to build, we're going to build a mock client, which is going to represent like an AJAX call. But the mock client is going to be used when you're in localhost mode. But then the real AJAX call, we're going to build another method for the real AJAX call that will be launched or called when we're actually in the dev tenant. So let's go ahead and get started with our mock HTTP client. So we get a chance to build our first TypeScript file, which is pretty cool. And we're going to call that mock HTTP client .ts. And it seems the .ts is very important. So once we have that, I'm going to just go ahead and grab this code snippet. It's going to do an import on, nope, not hello world, not for you, Deshaun, because you got fancy and called it Deshaun's world. Again, that red squiggly is kicking in, is working wonders. Deshaun's world, spelling is very important here. Okay. So now that we have that, basically what it's going to do, that interface that we defined for lists with the title and ID members, we're going to bring that in. And then we're going to sit here. Basically, they're defining the mock HTTP class, right? And then within that class, we're going to have this internal or private member, right? And we know that from C# class, that private member, and I love the underscore, right? So that way if you look at it, you say, oh no, this is private, or no, yeah, this is defined. Okay, so you have this private member, and basically this is what I was talking about, right? So we have this list collection, and we know we have ISP list plural that does this exact same thing, .value, but in their sample they're not using it. So in here they have the title here, so they're going to set up a default list or mock list, right, on here. So let me just change this. Let me just call this list title 1, okay, and then that's going to be the ID 1. And then here they have a public method that's going to say, hey, get, here's the parameters, passing your REST URL, passing your options, and then it's going to return a promise of the type list array, right? So array of those SP list objects. And then all this other shenanigans, just really creating a fake promise and then resolving this guy here, which they're faking, hey, this is the data that will be returned in the AJAX call. And because the real AJAX call returns a promise, the mock method should follow that same signature. Signature as in input parameters, which is really not that important. Well, maybe if you're doing testing, you don't want to have to modify it. Say, oh, it's local. I only have one option, where, oh no, it's live, so I have to have 2 options. So maybe they're matching the signature for the call as well as the return type from the actual AJAX method, which we're going to build. So as far as the mock client, really that's it. So you have these fake members here, and this is the fake data that we're going to return, and we have this fake method that's acting like it's returning a promise, and hydrate the return with that array. So we save this, Control C, and then Control S, not C. Okay, so the mock HTTP client is in place. Now in the main web part class, we want to import it, it looks like. Okay, so Now we know in C#, if we, because in mock we reference this file, and in this file we represent the mock, that would be a circular reference. But here in JavaScript world, you can get away with that, even with TypeScript on top. So I'm a big not stickler, but it's very confusing to me when we name a lot of things the same thing. Like the mock HTTP client was actually been, and then we defined a variable called mock HTTP client. To me, it's not clear on what's doing what, especially when you're learning something. If everything's named the same, like the file name and the class name matches, it may be best practice, but it's hard to distinguish what is what. So like this reference here, I just found out because I screwed up. This is actually the actual file name. So if you had this, mock HTTP client, and then the class is mock HTTP client, it's kind of tell that it's hard to tell that, what this is referencing. Is it referencing the default class in this file, or is it referencing the file itself? And because it has like this, path, whatever, it's actually referencing the file itself. Because for some odd reason, I recreated this, and it didn't find a reference. I had to close Visual Studio Code and recreate. So if you run into that, that's one solution. That sometimes you have to close down Visual Studio Code and then reopen it, and then all the references seem to define themselves. Just an oddity. But through playing with that, I purposely made the class name and the file name separate, and then realized that the reference was to the file name. And then when you come in here in the web part, so in this case we don't do it, but like in these guys here, these are multiple classes or interfaces defined in this file. So in this import, you're specifying to say, hey, this guy may have 20 classes, only give me these 4 or these 5, right? Maybe the star brings them all out. I have no idea, right? I'm just still learning. But anyway, I realized that this is setting a local variable. I guess it assumes that there's only one class. Here's another thing I noticed. When you define these classes, one of them will be defined as default. And I assume when you're doing the import, if you don't specify a class or an interface or whatever the module or whatever you call it, this will be the guy return. That's an assumption until I am proven or see something different. So that's another thing that I picked up. So basically, I'm saying, okay, reference this file. The default class, because I didn't specify anything like I do here. This is where you specify again which one of those interfaces, modules, or classes you want to pull from that file, and set it to this local variable client, right? So that's one change I did make. Now that's going to come and bite me, I bet, because I'm copying and pasting this directly as it appears from the tutorial. Now we're defining this, and you notice that we are defining these interfaces in addition to the default. Oh, there you go. There's a prime example. The default web part class, right? So if you collapse this, these guys, these export interfaces are not part of this definition. They're in parallel or, on the same line, colleagues of that definition. So this is an example of a TypeScript file with multiple classes. So just want to make that clear. Now, what I need to do, looking at this, get mock list data, and this is a private method, okay, and that's going to be defined inside of the web part class. So let's go ahead and drop that in. But what I'm going to do, I usually, anything that I add, I usually try to put it towards the end, right? Especially private members. Private members I either put at the top, closer to the constructor, or above the constructor, or very at the bottom, below all the protected and public methods. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to drop this guy in on the private. And what is this doing? Okay, so this is private. So even their method names, they prefix with an underscore, fine. It returns a promise of, oh, look at this, the SPList collection interface that we define, and not the explicit array. And this is where things get interesting, right? I'll get a red squiggly here because I renamed this to client. I guess you can probably do this client as well, right? No? Oh, it's $this. This client. Okay. Should I do that? No, let's not do that. Let's not get fancy, Deshaun. Things are breaking. You don't know why. All right, so I'm gonna just do explicit client. And I guess I could have done $this, but all right. So client.get. Now this get method that's calling off this is this guy here, right? So we're calling the fake. We're calling the mock. Yeah, get mock list, which is the name of that. So get, pass in the absolute URL, which is it's not going to do anything. You can actually pass in garbage there, and then it kind of works through. Now this data, I'm not a this whole syntax here. I know promises only with dealing with Ajax and jQuery and the HTTP client method in Angular. So I'm familiar with promises. And I know the core concept, right? And basically it says, okay, for this URL, well, this doesn't. I mean, this is faking the funk. But basically it says, okay, for this Ajax call or REST API endpoint, it's going to make an HTTP request, but it's going to return it. It's going to return this this collection object, right? Generic collection object right away, right? But this may take 2 or 3 seconds to render. Hopefully not 3 seconds. Usually it's milliseconds. And basically it says, okay, go ahead and return them this object, but it's a promise with the understanding that once I get that JSON back from that REST API call, that's the then hydrate this object, and that's all this gobbledygook here, which you already returned in the promise, and then it just hydrates it, so that way the caller then gets a bloated object or collection of objects, and then it can continue its processing. Very, very high level and grossly simplified explanation of promises, but you're going to see that a lot because everything is Ajax and you do not want to hold this thread as we're processing. Okay, so enough on that. So now we have our fake mock data called, and now we need to do the real guy. So let me go in here and get the real guy, and this is going to be another private method. Uh-oh, my curly brackets are getting out of whack here. So Shift Alt F does the code formatting for Visual Studio Code. Shift Alt F again. All right. So this is going to get list. So we got get mock list data, and then we got the get real list data. And the signatures, the parameters and the return types look very, very similar. So I think, from the get, from the real and from the fake, I think those are key. Now, how you define that in the definition, the hoops you jump through to make that happen, is a different story. I mean, those are hidden anyway from the caller, which it should be. So now in this get list data, basically what it's doing is say, okay, give me this content, get the HTTP client, and then it makes a get call, current web, and then here's the signature for list. Now I think I ripped this out because I think in the Microsoft tutorial they have another parameter, the OData filter, right, that says get the list but don't bring back hidden lists. So again, if you know anything about the API, you know that even SharePoint in general, you know that there are, what you see in the UI, there's a ton of other lists behind the scenes. So we have that guy there. So here I'm gonna bring back explicitly all the lists because I want to make sure we have something to play with. And then so that's the list data. Now let's take a look at. Oh, then they had us doing some rendering. Okay, so now they have us doing some SAS, some styling. And when we look at the styles, basically, a couple of things to note. I have these collapsed here, which is good, I think. I'm gonna just paste in the styles that they want us to reference. And really, these are just CSS. I misspoke in the previous video only because I wasn't that familiar. I'm glad, I was able to get to this level and get a chance to play around with it. So this looks like plain CSS, but when you save it, it actually updates this guy, which is the TypeScript version of that, right? So the new guys I just added in was the list item and then the list, and then it defines those here. And I think it's here when you go to the web part and you do a styles dot, it's pulling it from that interface. So if you go in here and you notice the styles dot container, the Sean world, that's a direct correlation to container and the Sean world. And now we just add in list item and then list. But the definition of these classes or classes, which will include color, font, size, and weight, and all this other good stuff, is actually here, which looks to me like plain CSS, right? But I think this guy here is what makes it, type safe, modularized, and all this other good stuff, and it help prevent defining CSS classes different names, but the definitions are the same, and then now over time gets very messy. So having IntelliSense that says, oh yeah, no, this is the class I want, oh yeah, this is the class name I was looking for, is very helpful. Now, so that's that. So we added the styles. What's next? So next they want us to do the render method. Okay, so in order to do the render methods, now the render method is going to be the key method that says, oh, you're in local mode, call the fake mock client. No, this is the tenant, so call the real Ajax call for that service request. So let's go ahead and drop that in. So in order to get the switch from local to real, we had to bring in this environment type from the SP client base file, right? So that's going to be the environment type, and this guy's going to have local or not. I think it's just a toggle, right? You either local or you're in the tenant. So now what we need to do is copy in render list, which is a private method that's going to be on the web part class. Drop this guy in here. Again, let me do my Shift Alt F, get everything straightened out. And if you look at this render list, basically it takes in an array of items, or returns it returns void. So it takes in an array. Oh, this just spit out everything in the array into HTML, right? And then it has this selector that it's going to dump it into. Okay, and we'll see how that works soon. So this is, okay, once you have the data, this is how I want to spit it out in HTML format. And then here you can tell that, they're grabbing the list item, the title. No, styles at list item. So this is that styles piece that we just did. So it's defining the class there for each list item. Then the container style is defining that there. And then there's a for each loop that iterates through the collection. And then this is what's spitting the collection item out. So pretty straightforward. And I like this. So the for each is very similar to C#, to where you can define a local variable. So if we wanted to do list, to where this makes more sense to us, when you take a look at it, and not getting confused with a list item, right? And you're dealing with the actual list. I think this feels natural, and because this is a local variable, we can make that change without blowing up anything else. So this looks good, and we'll see soon, in a second, where this all makes sense, right? So that piece is good. So what's next? Next, we have to do. Next we have to render list async. So this is another private method that they have for us. Yeah, okay, so this is the one that has to toggle Shift Alt F. All right, so this is the one that has to toggle. So this is the main guy. So this render list async, this is the one that says, okay, you brought in the environment type, right, from here. And based on the context, environment, and then type, if it's local, call the mock guy. And if it's real, call the real guy, which is this guy here. Now, I really like this. This is sweet. So if you right click on this and then click on go to definition, you actually go to the definition, very similar to C#. And you also have the peak, right? So that way you can show it inline if you didn't want to navigate away. And then when you finish peaking, you just close it up and you're back where you are. So that's actually really good. I use that a lot when I'm either new to a team, I'm trying to figure out how things are kind of stitched together and how it kind of works together, and I can kind of follow the path using that. So I use that a lot. All right, so where were we? So we were in render list async. This is not going to return anything. It's going to get determine what type of variable it is. I'm sorry, environment it is. If it's mocked, it's going to make the request call, and then it's going to get a promise, and then it's going to call render list, which is just going to take that data, call this method here, which is this guy with the HTML, and then spit them all out. So that's pretty straightforward. And then finally, to actually get this into our render method, we need to add a couple items to the render method. So basically, they have this div here. Ooh. Now I have to figure out which one of these divs this is supposed to go into. I think the second from the last. Yikes. All right, so you have this div here, which says, okay, spit the list out here inside this ID. And in your render method, that's what this guy does right here. That's exactly what this line does. So it said, hey, this is going to, for the DOM, for all that HTML that's already in the DOM, look for the div or an item or HTML tag that has this ID. That's very similar to, CSS, with a hashtag that has this ID, and then dump all this inner HTML there. Boom. So wherever I put this is where the list of the list of lists, is going to display. Now, then we need to call this guy here. We need to call outside of the render. Wait, is this outside of the render block? No, outside of this property here, we actually call render.list async. Now, this one from a cycle standpoint, I have no idea how, the timing of this. I just know in the Microsoft example, this is what they have. But we all know that if you call certain things too early and the DOM is not there, or the HTML is not there, or the selector that you're specifying is not there, we run into those types of issues, and they are a pain in the butt, right? Because those edge cases that you don't catch when you're doing the natural path of things, like pop-up windows and stuff like that. That you run into these cycle issues, like, oh no, this was called before, this was ready, and all this other stuff. So I assumed putting it here is a sequential timing thing that says, okay, this DOM is loaded, and now when you call this, which in the end through all its nested methods calls the selector, everything seems to work. So I don't know about that. So we would just have to circle back and take a look. Okay, so this is done. Let's save that, and hopefully we have everything saved. Now, if I go here, hit refresh, this is the tenant. Let's see what happens. Voila. Those are all my list items. I'm sorry, all my lists within this web. And it's a root web, so list template gallery and master page gallery after root web makes sense. If this was a sub web, I would expect not to see those guys, since those guys only live at the root web. So that's that. So let's go play around with this a little bit more. Actually, let's play around with this a little bit more in the next video. But yeah, so in the end, that's the sum of it. A lot of copy and paste code, right? I got very, very sketchy, high level understanding of how things are coming together. Dealing with this model exactly, I think I'm comfortable with bringing, and this is what we are doing in the next video, is bring in more properties for the list object and get those to display. But I'm still not comfortable yet that if I was given a UI, and I'm familiar with the REST API, so I know how to get the data, but stitch it together here like in this format, I'm sure I would stumble a bit. So going through each one of these and getting comfortable with understanding what does what and why, and then part two is to understand how you discover what lists and what properties or methods and all this other stuff will exist in the REST API and how you define those, like if you want to make changes and all this stuff in the interface. So we're going to jump into more of that in the next video. But for now, you know, play around with this. What I try to do to get me to really learn it, I usually I'll scrap this, I'll rebuild it again, scrap it, rebuild it again, scrap it, rebuild it again, try to rebuild it from memory, where the other attempts were using the tutorial. It's really like exercising. I mean, repetition is going to be the key, you know. So just kind of go from there. But that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next video where we actually start building off this model, start adding more things beyond the tutorial, and see if everything works as we expect. Okay, see you then.